The story of Jim Crow Chiles begins long before he held a gun, long before he rode with dangerous men, and long before his name became a whisper of warning across Missouri. It begins in the year 1833, in a rough, changing world on the Missouri frontier. From the moment he was born, the land around him was alive with tension. It was a place where small arguments turned into big fights, where neighbors watched each other with suspicious eyes, and where violence was as common as the wind blowing across the fields. Jim Crow Chiles entered this world as the son of a farming family. They were not wealthy, they were not powerful, but they were proud, strong, and fiercely tied to their land. Life was simple, but never peaceful. Most days were spent working, hunting, and surviving. But around every corner, danger waited. This was a region where people did not always trust the law. Instead, they trusted their fists, their knives, and eventually, their guns. Even as a young boy, Jim Crow seemed shaped by this environment. He was quick-tempered, bold, and stubborn. If another child insulted him, he did not walk away. If someone pushed him, he pushed back harder. Some said he fought because he enjoyed it. Others believed he fought because he felt he had no other choice. Whatever the reason, people noticed. They said, "That boy is going to be trouble. He's too proud, too wild." And they were right dot around him. Missouri was changing. Tension between free states and slave states grew heavier each year. Kansas, the territory next door, was filling with people who wanted to stop the spread of slavery. Many Missourians, including the Chiles family, strongly disagreed. These differences were not small political debates. They were fights that divided families and turned friends into enemies. Jim Crow grew up watching adults argue until their voices cracked, threaten each other over fences, and sometimes meet at dawn to settle scores with weapons. In this kind of world, a boy quickly learned that his fists might decide his future more than his education. School was not his priority. Adventure was, survival was, pride was. The older he became, the more confident he grew in his ability to defend himself. People heard stories of young Jim Crow taking on boys older and larger than him. Some stories said he won every time. Whether the tales were true or not, one thing was certain: Jim Crow Chiles was becoming the kind of young man people respected, or feared. By the time he reached his late teens, he had a reputation that reached beyond his hometown. He was known as someone who did not back down, someone who reacted fast and often without thinking, someone who saw disrespect as a personal attack. In those days, this kind of attitude could be dangerous, but it could also be admired. On the Missouri frontier, strong men were often seen as natural leaders. Jim Crow did not seek leadership, but he gained attention anyway. When he walked through town, people watched him. Some nodded, some whispered, and some stepped aside. Yet Jim Crow Chiles was not only a fighter, he was also fiercely loyal to the people he loved. He cared deeply for his family, especially his parents. He helped with farm work when needed, hunted to put food on the table, and protected his younger siblings whenever trouble appeared. In a world full of chaos, he learned early that family was the one thing worth fighting for, and sometimes worth killing for. By his early 20s, Jim Crow married Sarah Ann Young, a woman he adored. Together, they began building a family of their own. For a moment, it seemed like he might soften. Some believed marriage would calm his spirit, that children would give him new purpose, and that maybe he would finally settle into a peaceful life. But Missouri was not a peaceful place, and Jim Crow Chiles was not made for quiet living. During this time, the political conflict around him only grew worse. Kansas was becoming a magnet for settlers who wanted to make it a free state. Missouri's pro-slavery supporters felt threatened. Angry speeches filled taverns. Men argued over maps and laws they barely understood. Every farm, every barn, every dusty road seemed ready to erupt into conflict. This movement became known as Bleeding Kansas, a name that would soon spill into Jim Crow's own future. Jim Crow watched his world shift from tension to violence. Homes were burned, horses stolen, men beaten or killed in night raids. Missouri and Kansas were no longer neighbors, they were enemies. And Jim Crow, shaped by years of fighting and raised on a land where violence solved problems, felt drawn into this storm. He was not a man who ignored conflict. He leaned into it. He embraced it. He felt at home in the fires that scared others. And as Missouri slid toward war, There was only one direction for Jim Crow Chiles to go. He would step into the growing battle. He would take up arms. He would join the side he believed in, with the fury of a man who had been fighting his whole life. And this choice would set him on a path toward a darker future, one filled with blood, gunsmoke, and a legacy no one in his family could ever escape. This was the beginning of Jim Crow Chiles, the beginning of an outlaw the frontier would not forget. As Jim Crow Chiles grew older, the world around him did not calm down. Instead, it became more divided, more violent, and more unpredictable. By the time he reached his 20s, Missouri was no longer just a place of hard work and occasional trouble. It had become one of the most dangerous and politically explosive regions in the entire country. The tension between North and South, between free states and slave states, now touched every part of daily life. And for a man like Jim Crow, whose heart burned with pride and anger, this environment shaped him even more. Jim Crow was not the kind of man who stood quietly on the sidelines. He had grown up seeing conflict. He had grown up learning that strength meant survival. So when arguments turned into threats, and threats turned into violence, he did not hesitate to pick a side. Many people in Missouri felt their way of life was under attack. They feared losing their land, their traditions, and their identity. As Kansas filled with settlers who opposed slavery, Missouri felt cornered. Neighbors no longer trusted each other. Old friendships turned into bitter divides. Men who once shared drinks now glared at each other from opposite sides of dusty streets. Jim Crow felt that pressure too. He believed strongly in the Southern cause, just like many families around him. It was not only politics to him, it was personal. It was tied to pride, to family honor, and to the world he had grown up in. His beliefs hardened, and so did his temper. Those around him noticed he was quicker to speak, quicker to argue, and quicker to reach for a weapon if someone insulted him or his point of view. Despite this, Jim Crow still tried to build a normal life. His marriage to Sarah Ann Young brought him moments of peace. He enjoyed coming home to her warm smile, hearing the laughter of their growing children, and feeling, if only briefly, like an ordinary man. Some evenings, he sat on the porch and watched the sunset, imagining a calmer future. But the quiet never lasted long. Rumors of raids, shootings, and riots filled the air. Every week seemed to bring a new conflict. Town meetings grew heated. Local men formed groups to defend their borders. Kansas settlers did the same. It was like two storms forming next to each other, waiting for the winds to collide. And soon they did. Jim Crow Chiles found himself in the middle of a region tearing itself apart. Sometimes he tried to ignore it, focusing on his family and work. But that wasn't easy. Everywhere he went, someone mentioned Kansas. Someone mentioned the conflict. Someone accused someone else of treason or betrayal or cowardice. It was impossible to escape. And Jim Crow Chiles did not like feeling helpless. He was a man of action, a man who believed battles were not won with speeches but with strength. When he saw others preparing to fight, he felt the same fire rising inside him. He could not stay neutral. The world would not let him. By the late 1850s, violence had begun to spill openly across the border. Missouri men crossed into Kansas to fight for the Southern cause. Kansas men retaliated, sometimes attacking Missouri farms in the middle of the night. Homes were burned, livestock stolen, families forced to flee. Every attack created new anger, new revenge, and new enemies. Jim Crow watched these events with growing intensity. He felt anger rising each time someone described a Missouri family being harmed. He felt fury every time he heard Kansas men insult the South. His pride and loyalty pushed him toward action. Even those who knew him well could see the change. His jaw tightened more often. His hands rested near the handle of his pistol, even when he wasn't aware of it. Something inside him was shifting, slowly but powerfully. His wife Sarah sensed the change too. She sometimes begged him to stay close to home, to think of their children, to avoid the violence spreading across the land. She hoped he could resist the pull of conflict. But Jim Crow was not built for silence. He was built for confrontation, for intensity, for the heat of danger. And now the world around him seemed to demand men like him. Jim Crow did not rush into the conflict blindly, but with each passing month, he became more involved. He met with local men who shared his beliefs. He discussed strategies, rumors, and reports from across the border. He listened to talk of forming militias, of defending Missouri soil, of taking the fight to Kansas, if necessary. Every discussion lit another spark inside him. And this tension shaped him in another way too. He began carrying his gun more often, even when he walked into town on ordinary days. He became even more protective of his family. When strangers passed too close to his property, he watched them carefully. He became sharper, harder, less forgiving. By the early 1860s, the storm finally broke. The Civil War erupted across the nation. States were choosing sides. Men were choosing sides. And Jim Crow Chiles, his choice was already made in his heart long before war was declared. He stood on the edge of a decision that would change his life forever. The quiet man on the porch, the husband, the father, that side of him began to fade. In its place rose the fighter, the defender. The man shaped by conflict since childhood. He would no longer be a witness to violence. He would become a part of it. He would step into the armies forming around him, and he would choose a path that would lead him into the darkest chapters of the American frontier. The world had shaped Jim Crow Chiles. Now he would shape his own fate with fire, with fury, and with a gun in his hand. The world Jim Crow Chiles had known all his life was now collapsing into open war. Missouri and Kansas were no longer just neighbors. They had become enemies. And Jim Crow, shaped by years of anger, pride, and conflict, stood in the center of the storm that history would call Bleeding Kansas. The name itself said everything. It was not just a disagreement. It was not just a political argument. It was a wound deep, violent, and still bleeding. Across the borderlands, fear and fury spread like wildfire. Small farms became battlegrounds. Quiet roads turned into ambush points. And the question of whether Kansas would become a free state or a slave state was tearing men apart. Jim Crow watched all this unfold with growing intensity. Every story pushed him closer to action. A Missouri family burned out of their home. A Kansas settler shot in the dark. Missouri men crossing the border to intimidate their rivals. Kansas groups retaliating with equal force. It was a circle of revenge, and each act only fueled the next. For Jim Crow, the conflict became personal long before he stepped into it. He felt the anger in his bones. He felt the call to defend his beliefs, his land, and even his pride. Missouri was his home. The South was his identity, and he believed anyone attacking that identity was attacking him directly. Everywhere he went, he heard talk of Kansas. Men stood in saloons and argued with shaking voices. Women whispered fears behind closed doors. Newspapers printed stories filled with anger. The world seemed to be screaming for action, and Jim Crow Chiles was a man who responded to screaming at first. He tried to stay focused on his family. He worked the land, watched over his children, and tried to keep his mind steady. But the storm outside kept pounding on his door. He could not ignore it. He could not pretend it was far away. Trouble was too close. It was on the border. It was in the fields. It was at the doorsteps of Missouri towns. Then came the night that changed everything. A group of Missouri men rode through Jim Crow's area. They were angry, armed, and determined. They spoke about Kansas men raiding farms. They spoke about protecting their homes. And they spoke about forming groups men willing to ride, fight, and defend their side. When they stopped at his property, they told Jim Crow what had happened. A farm not far from his own had been attacked. Horses were stolen. A barn burned. The family barely escaped, and the attackers were believed to be Kansas Free State men. Jim Crow listened in silence at first, but inside him, something cracked open. He had seen enough violence in his life to know what this meant. The war that had been simmering was now boiling. These men wanted to push back. They wanted to strike first, and they wanted him to join them. He agreed without hesitation. It wasn't a dramatic moment. There were no speeches or long silences. Jim Crow simply nodded, walked into his home, grabbed his gun, and returned to the waiting men. Sarah, his wife, watched him with fear in her eye. She knew this step would pull him into something dark, something he might never be able to escape. But she also knew Jim Crow. She knew he could no more ignore a fight than he could stop breathing. That night, the men rode. They traveled through forests and fields, watching the border for signs of Kansas groups. The air felt heavy, like the world was holding its breath. Jim Crow rode in silence, but his eyes were sharp, scanning every tree, every shadow. They found nothing that night. But the ride marked the beginning of something much bigger. Jim Crow Chiles was now part of the conflict. As the weeks passed, the violence grew worse. Small raids turned into deadly encounters. More men joined the fight. Groups on both sides became more organized, and Jim Crow became more involved, riding with men who thought like him, fought like him, and believed the border needed to be defended with force. Each ride hardened him. Each story of violence sharpened his anger. Each attack on Missouri soil made him feel more certain he was doing the right thing. The line between defending his land and seeking revenge began to blur. Missouri was no longer just a place he lived. It had become a battlefield. Kansas was no longer just a neighbor. It had become the enemy. Jim Crow had always been a man of conflict, but now conflict became his purpose. He rode with increasing frequency. Sometimes they defended farms. Sometimes they hunted for raiders. Sometimes they simply patrolled the border with rifles ready. And every time he returned home, he looked more different, tougher, colder, shaped by the violence he had seen and delivered. People started whispering about him again, just like when he was a boy. But this time, the whispers carried fear. He doesn't back down. He's becoming dangerous. He's made for this war. By 1861, the tension reached its breaking point. The Civil War officially began. States chose sides. Armies formed. Flags rose and fell. The nation was now divided in two dots, and Jim Crow Chiles did not hesitate for even a moment. He stepped into the war like a man walking into his own destiny. The conflict of bleeding Kansas had shaped him, hardened him, awakened something fierce and unforgiving inside him. Now it would carry him deeper into violence than he had ever imagined. He would join a group that would become famous for, hated, and remembered the men of Quantrill's Raiders. Jim Crow Chiles had taken his first step into the darkest chapter of his life. The frontier had shaped him. Now war would transform him. When the Civil War finally exploded across America in 1861, the Missouri-Kansas border became one of the most violent places in the nation. Armies marched, homes burned, and neighbors turned into enemies overnight. But in the shadows of the official armies, another kind of war was being fought. A darker war. A personal war. A war without rules. This was the world of guerrilla fighters. And it was the world where Jim Crow Chiles would finally find his place. Jim Crow did not join the Confederate Army in a clean uniform with polished boots. That wasn't the kind of man he was. He preferred the open land, the fast horse, the freedom to act on instinct. He wanted to fight for the South, but he wanted to fight in his own way. And the men who fought that way already had a leader. William Quantrill. Quantrill was not a typical military commander. He was a legend whispered across the border. His men did not fight in lines or wait for orders from faraway generals. They rode hard, hit fast, and used fear as a weapon. Historians would call them outlaws and killers. Some Southerners would call them heroes. But whatever the world thought, they were feared. And Jim Crow Chiles was drawn to them like fire to dry grass. Jim Crow first heard of Quantrill long before meeting him. Stories spread everywhere. Stories of raids so fast the victims barely knew what happened. Stories of fearless riders charging through enemy towns. Stories of men who fought with a wildness that matched the burning hatred of the border war. But what impressed Jim Crow most was that Quantrill's men were loyal to each other, to their cause, and to their leader. They rode like brothers. They fought like wolves. And they survived when others fell. Jim Crow admired that. He understood that. He needed that dot. So sometime in the early 1860s, he made his decision. He packed his gear, mounted his horse, and rode out to join the guerrillas who matched the fire raging in his own heart. The moment he arrived at one of their hidden camps, he knew he belonged there. The men looked like him, hard eyes, rough hands, quick tempers. They sat around fires, sharpening knives, cleaning pistols, telling stories of raids and close calls. Horses snorted in the background. Gunpowder hung in the air like a second scent. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were fighters shaped by the border, just like Jim Crow. When Quantrill met him, the leader studied him for only a few moments before deciding he could ride with them. Quantrill valued bravery, loyalty, and a willingness to fight without hesitation. And Jim Crow had all of those things. Some say he even had them in excess. Soon, Jim Crow rode alongside men who whose names would one day become legends: Jesse James, Frank James, Cole Younger, Bloody Bill Anderson, and others who lived and died by the gun. Jim Crow fit nicely. He was a strong rider, a quick shot, and a man who didn't fear danger. He learned the guerrilla ways fast, how to move silently across fields at night, how to hide in forests until the moment of attack, how to disappear after a raid like smoke blown off the horizon. The fighting was brutal. These were not polite battles with flags and marching drums. These were ambushes, burnings, revenge attacks, and violent clashes where mercy was rare. Jim Crow proved himself quickly. In one early skirmish, when enemy soldiers ambushed a small group of Quantrill's men, Jim Crow did not run. He charged forward, firing at close range, helping his group break free. The others noticed. They respected him. Some even feared him. Quantrill himself later said Jim Crow Chiles was one of the men he could trust in a tight situation. Jim Crow appreciated that. Respect from a man like Quantrill meant something. As months turned into years, Jim Crow rode deeper into the war. He raided Kansas towns. He defended Missouri homesteads. He chased enemy riders through forests. And sometimes, he settled personal scores under the cover of war. Many guerrillas did. That was the nature of this kind of fighting. But the violence also changed him. Each raid hardened him. Each loss sharpened his anger. Death became familiar to familiar. He saw friends fall from horses, shot without warning. He saw farms burned. He heard the cries of families caught in the middle of war. And through it all, he kept riding, kept fighting, kept fueling the fire inside him. Some nights, when the group rested after a raid, men laughed, joked, and counted their stolen supplies. But Jim Crow often sat quietly, staring into the fire. Something in his eyes grew darker as the war dragged on. He had always been quick-tempered, but now the anger was deeper. Tied to the violence he lived every day, he was becoming a true guerrilla, fighter, loyal and dangerous by the midpoint of the war. Everyone along the border knew the name Jim Crow Chiles. Some knew it with fear, some knew it with respect, and some knew it because they had lost loved ones in raids connected. To him or his companions, war had shaped him into the kind of man history remembers, and fears, Quantrills, raiders continued their operations year after year, surviving where others would have fallen. But the war was changing. The Confederacy was weakening. Union forces were growing stronger. The noose was tightening around every guerrilla rider, and Jim Crow Chiles, once a young man drawn into conflict, was now a hardened warrior facing a future filled with even more blood. He had chosen this path. He had embraced it, and he was ready to follow it wherever it led him. If it led him into darkness, he could not escape. This was Jim Crow Chiles, the fighter forged in the fires of bleeding Kansas, now riding with the deadliest guerrillas in the West. When the Civil War finally ended in 1865, the world Jim Crow Chiles had known was gone. The South was defeated. Quantrill's raiders were scattered, dead or running for their lives. Towns lay in ashes. Families were broken, and the old ways of the frontier were crumbling. But Jim Crow Chiles did not crumble. He walked out of the war alive, hardened and burning with the same fierce pride he had carried into battle, but without an enemy army to fight, without raids to plan, and without Quantrill's shadow to ride under. He was a man without a clear purpose, and men like him, men shaped by war and conflict, rarely return to quiet lives, with no interest in surrendering or apologizing. Jim Crow returned to Missouri and Kansas City, trying to rebuild a life. He came home to his wife Sarah Ann and their children, hoping to place at least part of himself back into family life. But war leaves scars that home cannot heal, and the world he returned to had changed more than he expected. Missouri was filled with bitterness. Former Confederates were looked at with suspicion. Union supporters often held the power. Old grudges from before the war resurfaced. Some people were ready to forgive. Others wanted revenge. Jim Crow belonged to neither side. He wasn't ready to forget the war, and he wasn't ready to forgive anyone who had wronged him. He carried the anger of years of violence like a shadow that followed him everywhere. He tried to settle into ordinary work, but struggled. His temper flared to isolate. His pride clashed with authority, and his war-honed instincts made him suspicious of nearly everyone. People quickly learned to avoid arguing with him. Even a simple misunderstanding could turn into a heated confrontation at times. He was calm and friendly, especially around his family. But when something sparked his temper and insult, a rumor, a dispute over money, he exploded with the same intensity he used in war. The line between the battlefield and the streets blurred for him. He still carried a pistol, and he still believed the only real law was the one a man enforced with his own hands. In the years after the war, Jim Crow Chiles became known as a man you didn't want to cross. He opened saloons, he ran gambling rooms, he dealt in horses, and he moved in circles where whiskey, anger, and guns mixed freely. Kansas City was growing fast, a place full of opportunity, but also full of crime. Former guerrillas, Union soldiers, thieves, gamblers, and desperate settlers all crowded into its saloons and streets. It was the perfect environment for a man like Jim Crow. Got it. Wild and unpredictable. Local newspapers sometimes wrote about him, describing him as dangerous, volatile, and always armed. His name alone could make men nervous. Some admired him for his courage. Others feared him for his temper. Lawmen especially watched him closely. He didn't trust them. They didn't trust him, and neither side hid it. Jim Crow despised authority. In his eyes, most officials were weak, corrupt, or biased against former Confederates. When a marshal or a deputy tried to question him, he responded with hostility or cold silence. If someone threatened him, he threatened back twice as hard. More than once, he found himself involved in shootings or fistfights that barely avoided turning deadly. But he had a way of slipping out of trouble, sometimes through clever words, sometimes through friends in the community, and sometimes through pure intimidation. Still, he wasn't just a fighter. He was also a father and husband trying to hold his family together. His children admired him, even feared him at times, but they knew he loved them fiercely. He worked hard to provide for them, even if his methods sometimes walked the line between legal and illegal. But Jim Crow's pride often pulled him into conflict. He believed deeply in honor, and whenever he felt insulted or wronged, he acted without hesitation. People in Kansas City learned to avoid provoking him, but trouble still found him, because trouble, in many ways, was part of who he was. One story tells of Jim Crow confronting a man who spread a rumor that insulted him. Jim Crow walked into a crowded saloon, faced a man directly, and warned him without raising his voice. But his hand rested on his pistol the entire time. The man apologized quickly, knowing Jim Crow's reputation for action matched his words. That was the kind of presence Jim Crow carried. He didn't always need violences. History did the talking. But the scars from the war ran deeper than even he realized. He often drank heavily. He often spoke of past battles, and sometimes, late at night, he became restless, pacing the house or slipping outside to breathe in the dark. War had shaped him into a storm, and storms rarely settled peacefully. By the early 1870s, Kansas City's law enforcement began cracking down harder on former guerrillas, outlaws, and violent men. Jim Crow felt targeted. He believed the city was trying to break him, to force him into silence, or push him out entirely, and his reaction was predictable. He pushed back. He argued more. He fought more. He stood his ground even when it put him in danger. Every conflict added fuel to a fire already burning inside him. Every argument made him more defiant, and every officer who confronted him reminded him of the enemies he fought during the war. The streets of Kansas City were changing. The law was tightening its grip. But Jim Crow Chiles wasn't built for rules and order. He still believed in the old ways, the frontier way. A man should speak boldly, defend himself, and never back down. This belief would soon put him on a direct collision course with the law, a collision that would bring his long, violent journey to its inevitable end. Jim Crow Chiles had survived war. He had survived raids, ambushes, and battles. But surviving peace, that was harder than surviving bullets. And his final fight was waiting for him, just around the corner, long before history would remember Jim Crow Chiles as an outlaw, long before newspapers wrote about his violent temper, his wild anger, and his deadly gun. A quieter story was forming in the background, one that no one at the time could have imagined. It began with his family, even in the middle of chaos. Jim Crow Chiles loved his children deeply. He was strict, protective, and sometimes frightening. But he was also tender in his own way. He would give his children rides on horseback. He would bring them small presents from town. He would teach them to be strong, to stand tall, and never let anyone walk over them. He wanted them to survive in a world he believed was dangerous and unfair. Among these children was a daughter, named Martha Ellen Chiles. She was quiet, thoughtful, and kind, almost the opposite of her father. Where Jim Crow was hard and fierce, Martha Ellen was gentle and steady. She grew up watching her father argue, fight, and sometimes explode with rage. But she also saw moments when he softened, when he smiled, when he showed a warmth he kept hidden from the outside world. Because of these moments, she loved him, and Jim Crow loved her. As she grew older, she became the emotional center of the family. She helped her mother with chores, looked after the younger children, and brought calm into a home that often felt like a storm. Even Jim Crow seemed different around her, more patient, less sharp, more willing to listen. In the years after the Civil War, Kansas City and the surrounding areas began to rebuild. New businesses formed, new families arrived, new friendships were made, and into this changing world came a young farmer named John Anderson Truman. John Truman was everything Jim Crow wasn't. He was quiet, he was patient, he avoided trouble. He didn't drink heavily or gamble. He didn't fight unless he had to. He believed in steady work, simple living, and peaceful days. Yet, when John Truman met Martha Ellen, he fell in love almost immediately. Her calm nature matched his own, her gentle strength impressed him, and she understood his quiet ways. Their courtship was simple and honest. Two young people finding comfort in each other during a time when the world still felt uncertain. But there was one shadow hanging over them. Martha Ellen's father, Jim Crow Chiles, was known throughout the region. His reputation for violence, anger, and trouble made many people nervous. He was respected by some, feared by others, and watched closely by almost everyone. When people learned that John Truman was spending time with Jim Crow's daughter, many warned him, "Be careful. Stay out of that man's way. He's dangerous." But John Truman was not afraid of Jim Crow. He was respectful, polite, and steady even when speaking to the fiery outlaw. And surprisingly, Jim Crow seemed to respect him back. Maybe it was because John looked Jim Crow in the eye without trembling. Maybe it was because he treated Martha Ellen kindly. Or maybe Jim Crow simply recognized that this quiet young man loved his daughter sincerely. Whatever the reason, Jim Crow did not stand in the way of their relationship. In time, Martha, Ellen, and John Truman married, beginning a new chapter far different from the life Jim Crow lived. They started a home, worked hard, and raised children of their own. Their life was calmer, more predictable, more peaceful, and it was into this home that a baby boy was born in 1884. Truman, the boy who would one day become the 33rd President of the United States. This is the part of Jim Crow story that feels almost unbelievable. A violent gunslinger, a guerrilla fighter, a man chased by a man with a reputation dark enough to scare entire towns. This man became connected by blood to a future president. Harry Truman never met his grandfather-in-law. Jim Crow Chiles died about a decade before Truman was born, but the stories lived on, stories passed quietly through family conversations, whispered at gatherings, or mentioned only when someone asked about the wild old days. The Truman family never forgot that they were tied to a man as fierce and unpredictable as Jim Crow. Even Harry Truman himself heard the stories as a boy. He learned that one of his ancestors had lived by the gun and died in a shootout. And years later, when Truman became a national figure, reporters sometimes dug into his family history. They discovered the connection, the name, the outlaw bloodline. But Truman rarely spoke about it. He once admitted that Jim Crow Chiles was something of a problem. But he quickly added that his grandmother, Martha Ellen, was the most stable, loving influence in his life. Her strength, quiet, gentle, resilient, helped shape him far more than the violent legacy of her father. Still, the connection remained. A gunfighter's blood running through the veins of a president. It is one of the most powerful contrasts in American history, of the idea that a man forged by violence could be linked to a man who once controlled the mightiest nation on earth. It shows how unpredictable family lines can be, how one life can twist into another, and how history sometimes writes stories no novelist could imagine. Jim Crow Chiles never lived to see what his family would become. He never knew his daughter would raise a future president. He never knew his bloodline would step out of the dust and bullets of the Wild West and into the bright lights of Washington. DCTHE world saw him as an outlaw. His family saw him as a father. And history now sees him as both a violent figure whose legacy took a turn no one could have predicted. But while the Truman connection is surprising, Jim Crow's story was far from over. The same traits that made him a fierce guerrilla, the temper, the pride, the refusal to back down, were tightening around him once again, and soon they would lead him into a final confrontation, one that would end his life the only way it ever could, in a gunfight by the early 1870s. Jim Crow Chiles was living in a world that no longer fit him. Kansas City was growing fast stores, railroads, new families, new laws. People wanted peace, order, and stability. But Jim Crow had been shaped by violence, war, and pride. He lived by an older code, a frontier code, where a man defended his honor with his own hands. And in a city trying to modernize, a man like him stood out like a loaded gun on a dining table. Jim Crow still ran saloons, dealt in horses, and moved through neighborhoods where everyone knew his name. Some greeted him respectfully. Some avoided him. Some watched him with quiet fear. He had friends, yes, but he also had enemies. Many men from Kansas City's early days had grudges against him. Some hated him for his Confederate past. Others hated him because he was too quick to fight. And a few simply feared the power he seemed to carry, wherever he walked. But one food a simple argument at first would grow into the spark that ignited the final explosion of his life. The trouble began at the Kansas City River Wharf, a busy place full of workers, merchants, and constant noise. Boats came in loaded with goods. Drivers shouted orders. The smell of fish, mud, and steam filled the air. And right in the heart of all this movement stood Jim Crow Chiles, a man who did not blend into crowds. He was there on business, buying or selling, depending on the day. But business at the wharf often came with tension. People argued over prices, over space, over who stepped in front of whom. One wrong word could turn a peaceful morning into a dangerous situation. On this particular day, Jim Crow crossed paths with a man named Richard Dick Taylor. Taylor was not a stranger. He was someone Jim Crow had argued with before. Rumors said they had a long-standing grudge. Some claimed Taylor once cheated Jim Crow in a horse deal. Others said Taylor insulted him in public. Whatever the origin, the tension between them was real and heavy. When their eyes met that day, both men stopped. The noise of the wharf faded. The air thickened. The old anger arose between them like smoke from a fire. Taylor muttered something, maybe an insult, maybe a challenge. Jim Crow fired back with a sharp reply. Voices rose. Faces reddened. Hands moved closer to belts. People nearby noticed the growing heat. They knew these two men. They knew their tempers. Some stepped away to avoid the blast that might come. Others stayed, drawn by the possibility of a fight. The argument escalated quickly. Jim Crow accused Taylor of lying. Taylor shouted back that Jim Crow was a bully who thought he owned the riverfront. Insults flew. Threats followed. Then Taylor made a mistake. He stepped forward too close. Too bold and shoved Jim Crow in the chest. The reaction was instant. Jim Crow's hand shot toward his pistol. But before either man could make the deadly move, someone shouted, "Get the law. Get the marshal." Within moments, officers were running toward the commotion. Among them was Marshal George McGee, a respected lawman known for being steady, fair, and brave enough to handle dangerous men. McGee had dealt with trouble before, but he knew this situation was different. He knew Jim Crow Chiles. He knew the stories. He knew the temper. Approaching Jim Crow was like approaching a wild animal calm until threatened. Then explosive, McGee tried to take control of the moment. He ordered both men to step back. He demanded they put down their weapons. He spoke with authority, his voice carrying across the wharf. But Jim Crow was still burning from the shove, from the insult, from the years of grudges. He felt disrespected, cornered, and watched by a crowd he did not trust. And when Jim Crow felt cornered, he did not back down. He never had. Not as a boy, not as a soldier, not as a father, and certainly not now. Taylor continued shouting at him. McGee told them both to calm down. Jim Crow's hand shook not from fear, but from fury. Witnesses would later say the whole scene felt like a pot about to boil over. Some people tried to help, pulling Taylor back, trying to create space, but the damage was done. Pride was injured. The anger was alive. And Jim Crow Chiles was not a man who walked away from unfinished business. As officers tried to separate them, Jim Crow gave Taylor one final warning, a quiet, sharp sentence that chilled everyone standing near him, and then he turned away not because he surrendered, but because he planned to settle things later, on his own terms. McGee stepped in front of him. He blocked Jim Crow's path. He reached out a hand, intending to restrain him. This moment, this single moment would send everything spiraling toward tragedy. Jim Crow pulled his arm away sharply. McGee warned him again. Taylor shouted something from behind, and Jim Crow, fueled by rage and humiliation, reached for his gun. The officers reacted immediately. Hands flew. Voices shouted. Crowds scattered. The tension had snapped at the fuse, had been lit. This was no longer an argument, no longer a simple feud, no longer just another fight at the wharf. It had become a deadly spark that would lead Jim Crow Chiles straight into the final gunfight of his life. The confrontation with Taylor was only the beginning. The real battle with the law was waiting for him, and soon Kansas City would witness the violent end of one of the fiercest men ever to walk its streets. The River Wharf argument had ended in chaos, but for Jim Crow Chiles, it was far from over. He walked away that day with anger burning inside him like a hot coal he couldn't put out. The shove, the loud insults, the crowd watching him. Jim Crow felt humiliated, and for a man like him, humiliation was almost worse than injury. He returned home restless, pacing back and forth, replaying every moment in his head. The anger grew darker with each memory. He told himself he had been disrespected. He told himself Taylor had crossed a line, and he told himself the marshal, George McGee, had interfered in a matter that didn't concern him. Jim Crow was not the kind of man who let things go, and everyone who knew him understood that the conflict was far from finished. Over the next hours and days, the tension across Kansas City grew thick. Word spread quickly. Jim Crow Chiles had drawn on the marshal, or nearly had. Some said McGee had threatened him. Others said Jim Crow had threatened the whole police force. Rumors twisted and stretched. But one thing became clear. The law was watching Jim Crow now, closely. Marshal McGee was not a coward. He knew his job demanded facing danger head-on. And Jim Crow was danger in human form, a man who had lived through war and came out sharpened instead of broken. McGee understood that letting a man like him walk freely after such a confrontation could lead to something worse later. Jim Crow, meanwhile, refused to calm down. He walked the streets with a hard stare. He entered saloons with sharp movements, as if waiting for someone to challenge him. His friends warned him that the law was preparing to arrest him. He only snorted. Arrest Jim Crow Chiles? Not likely. Not without a fight. On the morning of September 21st, 1873, the air in Kansas City felt strangely heavy, as if the town itself sensed what was coming. Jim Crow rode into town on horseback, moving with purpose. Some said he was looking for Taylor. Others believed he was ready to confront Marshal McGee directly. No one knew for sure, but everyone feared the outcome. He rode down Main Street, his coat pushed back just enough for people to see the pistol at his side. Some men stepped aside as he passed. Some watched from windows. Some whispered his name like a warning. Jim Crow stopped near a busy section of the street, not far from where the earlier argument had taken place. He tied his horse and began walking toward a group of men. His eyes burned with determination. That's when someone spotted the marshal. George McGee was nearby, patrolling the area with another officer. When he noticed Jim Crow, he slowed. He studied him for a moment. Then he approached, not recklessly, not arrogantly, but with the calm focus of a man who knew danger and had chosen to face it anyway. The crowd watched in silence. McGee moved closer. Jim, he said, you need to come with me. Jim Crow didn't move. His jaw tightened. His fingers twitched near his belt. You're under arrest, McGee continued. No trouble. Just come quietly. But Jim Crow Chiles had never been a quiet man. The two men locked eyes, one shaped by law, the other shaped by war. And then it happened so fast. Most witnesses couldn't say who drew first. Some swore McGee reached for his pistol. Some insisted Jim Crow made the first move. Others claimed both men reacted at the same instant. What everyone agreed on was this: the street exploded in gunfire. Jim Crow's hand flashed to his pistol. McGee reached for his own. Shots cracked across the morning air like thunderclaps. People dove behind barrels and wagons. Horses reared in panic. Shopkeepers pulled children inside. Smoke filled the street as bullets flew. Jim Crow fired with deadly accuracy, just as he had in the war. One bullet struck Marshal McGee in the chest. The marshal staggered, fell, and collapsed on the wooden planks of the walkway. The sight threw the crowd into terror. Jim Crow, breathing hard, stepped back, readying another shot. But before he could move again, the other officer fired. Then another officer joined from across the street. They had no time to think, no time to negotiate. Their marshal was down. Jim Crow had become an immediate threat. Gunfire tore through the dusty air. Bullets smashed into barrels, posts, and walls. One shot ripped through Jim Crow's shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Another struck his side. Another hit his chest. He stumbled, but didn't fall not yet. He fired again, wild, desperate, refusing to surrender. He had survived war. He had survived ambushes. He had survived battles no sane man should walk away from. But he could not survive this moment. The final bullet hit him hard enough to drop him. His knees buckled. His pistol slipped from his fingers. He fell backward onto the street he had walked with such confidence only minutes before. The noise faded. The gun smoke thinned. The crowd slowly emerged from hiding. Marshal McGee lay still, dying from his wound. Men knelt beside him, calling for help, praying he might survive. Jim Crow Chiles lay in the dirt, not shouting, not fighting, just breathing in shallow, uneven gasps. Blood spread beneath him like a shadow. For the first time in his life, he could not rise. He could not fight back. He could not chase his enemy. He had reached the end of his long, violent road. Some witnesses said he tried to speak, but the words never formed. Others said his last look was one of defiance and willing, even in death, to admit defeat. And some said he looked peaceful, as if the fire that burned inside him for so many years had finally gone out. Minutes later, Jim Crow Chiles, the guerrilla fighter, the outlaw, the storm of Missouri, was dead. He had lived fast. He had fought hard, and he had died exactly the way everyone expected, in a gunfight. The gun smoke had hardly cleared when word began to spread, first through Main Street, then across Kansas City, and finally throughout Missouri and Kansas. Jim Crow Chiles was dead. The man feared by many, respected by some, and known by nearly everyone on the border had fallen. The outlaw who had survived ambushes, raids, wartime chaos, and countless fights had finally met an end even he could not escape. And that end came at the hands of the very law he had pushed away his entire life. The news hit the town like a shockwave. Some people breathed a sigh of relief. They felt safer knowing he was gone. Others whispered quietly, unsure how to feel about a man who had been both dangerous and strangely loyal to his friends. And a few people mourned him, remembering not the outlaw, but the man they once knew, the father, the husband, the friend from years before war changed him. But no one ignored the news. Jim Crow Chiles had left a mark on the frontier, and even in death. His name carried weight. Marshal George McGee, the lawman who died from Jim Crow's bullet, became a symbol of duty and sacrifice. The town honored him as a man who stood against chaos, a man who protected the growing community from the lingering violence of the past. Newspapers wrote about his bravery, calling him a hero who gave his life to uphold order. And beside those articles, in the same papers, appeared the darker story, the death of Jim Crow Chiles, the guerrilla fighter who had refused to change with the times. One newspaper called him a dangerous relic of the war. Another described him as a man whose temper was as quick as his trigger. Some accounts were harsh, painting him as nothing more than a murderer. Others tried to understand him, noting that he was shaped by a world of violence long before he ever became an outlaw. His body was taken away quietly. There was no grand funeral, no large crowd, no public display. Family members came, grieving carefully, aware that half the city saw Jim Crow as a villain. They buried him without speeches, without celebration. Only the sound of wind through the trees marked the moment. His wife, Sarah Ann, was left with deep heartbreak. She had lived through years of uncertainty, waiting for the day trouble might come for her husband. Now that day had arrived, and she faced the truth she had feared for so long. The world had taken Jim Crow from her and from their children. Yet she also knew the man behind the reputation, the man who once tried to build a life, who held his babies, who loved fiercely even when he expressed it in flawed ways. His children, including Martha Ellen, mourned him in their own quiet ways. Some were old enough to remember his temper. Others remembered his rare smiles, or the nights he carried them to bed after long days of work. Martha Ellen felt a complicated sadness. She knew her father had lived a harsh life, but she also knew he had tried to protect his family in the only way he knew. But outside his family, the rest of the region felt another wave of emotion, a sense of closure. For years, Jim Crow Chiles had symbolized the unfinished business of the Civil War. He was a reminder that violence did not end when peace was declared. He represented the anger, the trauma, and the bitterness that haunted Missouri and Kansas long after the soldiers went home. And now, with his death, it felt to many like a chapter of that dark past had finally closed. The law in Kansas City tightened after the shootout. Officers became more confident, more assertive, believing that even the fiercest men could be stopped. Citizens began to trust the law more, feeling that the new order of the city was growing stronger. The death of Jim Crow became a cautionary tale, of warning that the wild ways of the old frontier would not survive in the new Kansas City. And yet, his story did not disappear. As the years passed, his name slipped into legend. Some told stories of his bravery during the war. Others spoke of his violent temper, and in some places, people talked about him like a ghost, a symbol of the turbulent past. Meanwhile, life moved forward for his daughter Martha Ellen and her husband, John Anderson Truman. They built their home, raised their children, and worked hard to give them stability. Martha Ellen rarely spoke about her father's final years, choosing to remember moments from her childhood when he had been gentler, but the shadow of his life still followed the family quietly. Then, decades later, that shadow would stretch all the way to Washington, D.C., when her son, Harry S. Truman, became President of the United States. Historians would uncover the connection. Newspapers would write articles about the wild outlaw who was part of the Truman family tree. Reporters would ask questions, and President Truman, always honest, would acknowledge the truth, even if he didn't speak about it often. He knew the contrast was striking, a gunfighter's blood running in the veins of a president, but in many ways, it reflected the country itself. America had grown from frontier violence to national leadership, from chaos to order, from outlaws to presidents. Jim Crow Chiles remained a symbol of the wild, violent roots of the American story, a reminder of how rough the past truly was. In the end, his legacy was not simple. He was not just a villain. He was not just a hero. He was a man shaped by the world he lived in. That world filled with conflict, anger, and hardship. He died the way he lived, fiercely, defiant, and unyielding. And even though he left behind a trail of violence, his story would echo across generations, reminding people of a time when survival required strength, when honor was defended with a gun, and when men like Jim Crow Chiles walked the borderlands of a nation still trying to define itself. When Jim Crow Chiles fell on that Kansas City street in 1873, it seemed like the end of his story. But in truth, it was only the end of the noise. The echo of his life, loud, violent, messy, and unforgettable, continued long after the gunfire faded. For decades, people kept telling stories about him. Some were true, some were exaggerated, some were shaped by fear, others were softened by memory. But they all tried to explain the same thing. Who was Jim Crow Chiles really? To some, he was an outlaw. To others, he was a veteran who never found peace. To a few, he was a loyal friend with a temper too big for the new world forming around him. But time has a way of shrinking even the biggest legends. As the years passed, the West changed. Kansas City became a modern city with trains, banks, schools, and busy streets full of people who never knew the smell of gun smoke in the air. New generations grew up without hearing the cries of Civil War raiders or the sound of horses thundering across the plains. The fear that once surrounded Jim Crow's name began to fade. He became a story, then a memory, then a footnote in old books about the border war. But his life still, mattered because it reflected something bigger than one man. Jim Crow Chiles was a symbol of a time when America itself was struggling to grow up. The Missouri-Kansas border had been a place of chaos long before the Civil War. It was a land where law changed from mile to mile, where justice came from the barrel of a gun, and where men lived by personal codes instead of written rules. Jim Crow had been shaped by that world, and when the world changed, he didn't maybe see OULD, and single quotes did not end with violence. It continued quietly through the people who survived him. His widow, Sarah Ann, worked hard to give their children a life different from the one Jim Crow lived. She taught them patience, kindness, and discipline, the qualities their father struggled with in his later years. She rarely spoke about the gunfight. When she did, she focused on the man she had once loved, not the outlaw people whispered about. His daughter, Martha Ellen, built a calm, stable home with her husband, John Truman. She rarely shared the darker parts of her childhood. Instead, she passed down gentler traditions, stories of family strength, perseverance, and love. She taught her children, including her son Harry, the value of hard work and steady living. The storm her father carried inside him became a reminder of what she wanted to protect her family from. And Harry S. Truman, who grew up hearing only fragments of the story, carried the legacy in his own quiet way. He became a man of discipline, responsibility, and restraint, the complete opposite of his fiery ancestor. As President of the United States, Truman made some of the most difficult decisions in American history. He once said he learned responsibility from his mother, a woman who had survived hardship with dignity. Still, the truth remained. The blood of a frontier outlaw ran in the veins of a president, and that truth revealed something powerful, something about America itself. The country was built by all kinds of people, farmers and fighters, gentle souls and fierce spirits, builders and destroyers, lawmen and outlaws. Some created order, some created chaos, but together they shaped a nation. Jim Crow Chiles represented the wild side of that journey, the side filled with conflict, pride, anger, and violence. He lived and died in a world where survival depended on strength and fearlessness, a world that no longer exists. Over time, historians would look back at him not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a man trapped in a brutal era. They would study the border war, the guerrilla raids, the outlaw culture, and the rough transition into peacetime. Man, they would find Jim Crow's life woven through all of it like a thread of fire. As the 20th century arrived, most people forgot his name. The Wild West grew quieter in the public memory. Newspapers stopped printing stories about the old raiders. Children learned about presidents and inventors, not guerrilla fighters. Jim Crow Chiles slipped into the shadows of history, but every now and then, his name surfaced again whenever someone explored the Truman family tree, or whenever researchers dug into the violent history of the Missouri-Kansas border. His life became a part of a larger story, a reminder of how unpredictable family lines can be, and how deeply history shapes the present. Jim Crow Chiles never imagined any of this. He never imagined the world that would follow him. He never imagined that someday his bloodline would rise from the dusty frontier to the highest office in the country. He died believing his legacy was written in the memories of the men he fought with and against. He died believing he was part of a battle that would define his time. He did not know that the true legacy he left behind would be something far more complex. Today, he is remembered as a figure both dangerous and tragic, a man built for a harsh world, unable to adapt when that world began to change, a fierce fighter who could not find peace, a flawed man whose descendants would rise far beyond the limits of the life he lived. He is a reminder that history is not clean, it is not simple, it is not gentle, it is wild, unpredictable, and full of contradictions. Just like Jim Crow Chiles, his story ends here, not with gunfire, not with rage, but with understanding. He was a product of his time, and his time was a storm. And sometimes, storms create the calm that comes after them.